Okay, I think we're going to go ahead and get started, knowing that people will kind of filter in over the next few minutes. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Ben Wilfon. I'm the director of the Truman Katz Center for Pediatric Bioethics. And today is our annual Truman Katz Grand Round. So you've heard the word Truman Katz twice. And unfortunately, Truman is a real person. In fact, he's usually here. Unfortunately, because this is in November this year instead of October, he's already in Palm Desert. But Truman was the CEO of our hospital for 26 years. And when he retired, the Board of Trustees endowed the center in honor of Truman's commitment to improving healthcare in the state of Washington. And we're really very honored to be named after him and have his support. But what I want to do is, every year I try to, because it's now been almost over 10 years, I always want to spend a few moments just telling all of you in the room who don't know Truman about him, because he really did make some remarkable contributions to this hospital that we are still reaping the benefits from. He really had very strong financial management. He got a lot of community support. He was responsible for trying to work through things with the community in terms of us being able to expand our buildings. And he developed many new innovative programs at the hospital. Oops, I hit the wrong button. Here we go. Now I'm getting myself. Okay, yes. And so included among those are really developing the relationship with the University of Washington, also creation of the working collaboratively with University of Washington and Fred Hutch to create the Seattle Cancer Care Alliance, and really kind of energizing the development of the research program that we now have in front of us as a very big part of Seattle Children's. Truman had a very long-standing interest in ethics. He's been interested in the ideas of quality of care, of respecting patients, and he really has always been innovative how he thinks about emerging issues in medicine, including clinical research, also complementary medicine, and that really led to his interest in developing our center. So for those of you who don't know about our center, I'll say just a couple words that we are really a center that is focused on research and scholarship, providing consultation and education, as well as training the next generation of people in bioethics. And part of that, and we have our lectureship as part of that. And we invite a nationally recognized speaker to come talk with us. So what I want to do now is tell you about our speaker, Christine Grady. But actually, before I tell you about Christine, today is actually is a special day, because in addition to having Christine, we also have Heather Fitzgerald with us, and who's sitting right behind Christine. And the reason why she's here as well is because both of these are scholars in bioethics who have a background in nursing. And as many of you may know, for the last year and a half, we have had funding from the Guild Foundation to train two fellows in bioethics, Christy Klee and Leah Kroon, who are leading what we call the Nurse Liaison Bioethics Program. And Heather and Christine will be staying the rest of the day with the nursing department in a variety of meetings with nursing leadership, with the liaisons, with the whole department on a range of issues. And in fact, I should mention to you that from 2 to 4, there is an education program that includes talks by each of them. And for those of you, and I believe those are, I forget which room they're in. Oh, 905, yes. And one will be talking about the integration of clinical care and research, which Christine will do, and Heather will be talking about issues of moral fitness. So if you have any time to come in the afternoon, we'd welcome that. So let me say a few more words about Christine. So Christine, it's really a pleasure to have you here. She actually was here 8 years ago for one of our regular grand rounds that's case-based, but we decided to have her here again for this Truman Katz lectureship for a number of reasons. And in particular, it was because of the fact that the hospital is continuing to think about the issue of the integration of clinical care and research. And as I thought about that issue, Christine came to mind as the best person I could think of to talk about this. So Christine, I've actually known for almost 18 years, because when I moved to Bethesda to the NIH to be part of the NIH Bioethics Department, that Christine was a colleague of mine. She's now the director of that program. And for those of you who are not familiar with the NIH Clinical Center, it is essentially a research hospital where clinical care and research are constantly integrated together. And so she will be talking today about an issue that we ourselves have been talking a lot about, which is the issue of broad consent for biobank and specimen research. Christine has a background in nursing. She has a PhD in philosophy from Georgetown. And I think the most important thing about Christine in my mind, well, that's many things are important about her, but she is an example of an innovative scholar. What Christine does is she takes issues that people haven't figured out yet and tries to think thoughtfully and creatively about them. And over the years, she has thought of many issues in research ethics and has really led a team that has really addressed many issues regarding how we think about payment for participation in research, how we think about issues in consent, how we think about obligations of researchers to deal with communities and support communities. And she really has been, I think, one of the major innovators in this. I will stop talking now and turn this over to Christine. And thank you very much for being here. Well, I have to
Put my slides up.
put your slides up, yes, of course.
Well, innovative is a very nice compliment, so thank you, Ben. I don't always think of myself as that, but maybe I am. So I am going to talk about broad consent for research and with biospecimens and data, ethical and some of the practical considerations. Hopefully this is not all new to you. I do work for the federal government, but I am not representing the views of the federal government, and I have no conflicts. So I thought I'd spend the time saying, you know, why are we even talking about broad consent? Why do we consider it? What is it? Is it ethically acceptable? And what are some of the objections? So that's what I'm going to try to do. Then I'll start by recognizing that researchers have been collecting and storing data and samples from research participants forever, for a long time. Now, I don't know about you, but you know, for many years we had data stored in file cabinets. A little hard to transfer or share with others, but that's how we stored it. We had samples stored in laboratories and, you know, on the shelves in the refrigerators. They got a little bit bigger over time. But this is not a new phenomenon. What's changed? What's changed is that we now have technologies, both digital and analytic, that allow for massive use of data and specimens to be able to answer questions that we couldn't have answered in the past, just because of the sheer volume of information and specimens that we have. So now this is what a biobank looks like. These are samples, and you can see sort of the massive amount. The Secretary's Advisory Committee on Human Research Protections estimates that there are billions of stored biospecimens in the United States, billions. We also have data repositories. This is a data repository, and you all know about storing data in the cloud. So there's tons of data about everybody, and a lot of this is health-related data. It's not all health-related data, but a lot of it is. So the possibilities for doing research with huge amounts of material that came from individuals but are no longer attached to those individuals, that are stored in these massive repositories, biobanks and data repositories, and can answer very valuable, people argue, research questions, is a relatively new phenomenon. And so this is why we're talking about broad consent, because from the beginning of creating biobanks and creating biorepositories, there's been a debate about, do we need consent? Is this really human subjects research? When you look at that biobank and the repository, where is the human subject in that biobank? Is this really human subjects research? And if it is, what kind of consent do we need to get from people, if any, in order to be able to use their discarded, in many cases, specimens or data about them that may be aggregated with others in order to answer important questions? I find it interesting that the question about do we need consent in this space and what kind of consent do we need in this space has gotten more attention than almost any issue in research ethics for a long time. There's tons of papers on this, tons of debates about this, tons of articles about this, and still no consensus, I would argue. So in thinking about consent, I think it helps us to remember that there are lots of sources of information, data and specimens, and they're not all the same. So you can imagine when you're thinking about asking people for permission or consent to obtain their samples or their data for future use, there's lots of different settings that matter. So if you're doing it in a research setting, that feels very different than if you're getting data or samples in a clinical setting, or in a public health setting, or in a forensic setting, or in a commercial setting. And I put commercial and social media. Social media, at least so far, I don't think we're collecting specimens, but we certainly are collecting lots of data. And there's probably other places we're collecting data that we're using for health-related reasons. There's also a broad range of research uses. Research uses sharing across the world, commercial uses, therapeutic uses, and unknown uses at this point in time. So how do we currently think about consent for these things? So I'm going to start with data, although I will say that I said there's tons of papers and attention to the issue of consent. Most of it is related to specimens. There's a little bit related to data, and there is increasing amount of attention to data, but I think it's a little behind in terms of the discussions. But we have some information. Or we know that people do research with medical records and deposit medical record data into repositories and do research with those data in repositories, often without any consent of the people about whom that data is, or whatever the English is. So as long as it's de-identified according to the regulations, there is no reason that you need consent, and there's no reason that you need to follow the human subjects regulations. There's also a vastly increasing amount of health-related research using data on social media. And I think it's really interesting to think about this as another example of where some kind of notion of broad consent might make some sense. But what's happening currently? So you may all know that there's some health-related research that's been going on through Facebook and Twitter and OkCupid. A lot of it is just mining data, but there has been some manipulation kind of research in this space as well. And what happens now? If you read in the click-through agreements for some of these social media platforms, on page 22, in the middle of the paragraph about what we do with your data, there might be the word research. It's often there. But how many people get to that page? There are some examples, like Twitter has been doing some research related to alcohol use and alcohol interventions, and they actually mine the data first, and then they reach out to people and ask them to participate. So there are some direct requests, if you will, for use of data. What about in specimens? So biospecimens, or data without identifiable private information, according to our federal regulations, is not research with human subjects, and therefore consent is not required. Existing data or specimens, if they're publicly available and not identifiable, is exempt from the regulations, and therefore consent is not required. Secondary use of data and specimens that are identifiable, if the research meets certain criteria and the IRB agrees, consent can be waived. So there's a lot of research that's done with specimens and data that is done without any consent at all. I think currently we see a spectrum of methods of consent for use of specimens. At one end is this, what many people call blanket consent, which is basically a statement that says, you can use my tissues to do research or education. And I don't know what the Seattle Children's general admission consent form looks like, but if I've looked at some general admission consent forms for hospitals in many places around the country, and there's a statement sort of to this effect in many of them. Not all of them, but many of them. In the research setting, on the other hand, sometimes you see a sort of blanket statement in a long research consent form, but just as often you see this very specific kind of we'll use your specimens only for this disease, only for this gene, only for this, particular kind of research or whatever. So very specific consent. So we have examples of what people call blanket and what is called study specific or very specific. And then there's a whole range in the middle of currently existing consent processes, which I would probably put under the rubric of broad. And many biobanks actually use broad consent currently. However, currently, because of this spectrum and this variety, there remains uncertainty and disagreement about what's appropriate in what setting and what's appropriate across different kinds of circumstances. There is considerable variation in practice, as I've already mentioned, and this then creates a very complex, creates a mess in some cases in terms of tracking the cost and logistical challenges of, this set of samples can be used for this, but this set can't, and how do you keep them separate? How do you keep the information clear about what's permissible and what's not? We have data access committees, for example, that look at, is this particular use consistent with whatever the consent actually was, if there was any. So there's a lot of interesting chaos, I think, and uncertainty around this in this space. There's also been some public attention. So you probably all have, how many of you read Henrietta Lacks? Okay, so everybody read it. So, I mean, that I think has raised public awareness in a way that it's interesting that I find myself in settings even with people who are health professionals who say, oh, we would never do anything like that today. But of course, if Henrietta Lacks went into a hospital today, signed a general admission consent, had her tumor removed, and somebody took some of those tumor cells and de-identified them and sent them to the lab, we would do that without her consent. We absolutely would, and we do it all the time. Their mistake in many respects was putting her name on it and being able to come back to it. We also have the Havasupai case. You all familiar with that? So this was, is anyone not familiar? Raise hands. A couple. Okay, so this is a Native American tribe in the Grand Canyon who had a research relationship with Arizona State University. Arizona State University was doing research on type 2 diabetes, which is a serious problem in this tribe. And some years later, one of the members of the tribe discovered at a meeting, really, that some of those data some of the specimens that had been donated as part of that research project had been shared with other researchers who were doing research on schizophrenia and on evolution. And there were findings from those research projects that they found very offensive to their culture. And so they sued Arizona State and settled. Another case that got a fair amount of attention is the newborn dried blood spots. So many of you know that around the country in the United States, newborns are screened for a bunch of different genetic diseases when they're born, before they leave the hospital. And some of that blood is saved in dried blood spots and used for research purposes in aggregate ways, and et cetera. In 2 states, in Texas and Michigan, parents and other members of the public found this very disturbing and said, we do not want our babies' dried blood spots used for research without our consent. And in Texas, for example, this is from Texas, 5 million blood spots were destroyed in a 48-hour period. So there is some public attention to this. There's also some changing landscape with respect to policies and regulations. So the NIH has a genomic data sharing policy, which was ultimately published in 2014, which basically says that NIH expects the investigators to obtain consent from participants to share their genomic and phenotypic data, to share it and to deposit into the government database. HIPAA had an amendment in 2013, which many people read as loosening the requirement of having specific information about future research use to allow for disclosure for future research purposes, which was a little less specific. And then the Newborn Screening Saves Lives Act that was passed in 2014, again in response a little bit to the Texas and Michigan examples that I just gave, requires written parental consent for research use of dried blood spots across the country. And the Secretary's Advisory Committee on Human Research Protections recommended in response to this Newborn Screening Save Lives that OHRP develop a simplified one-time permission through broad consent. So there's a sense that all of these are sort of pointing to some kind of broad consent for future use and sharing. the sort of big earthquake was the Notice of Proposed Rulemaking, which was published, in 2015, following on an advanced Notice of Proposed Rulemaking, both of which are talking about changes to the Common Rule, proposed changes to the Common Rule. And in the NPRM in 2015, there were several things that were very dramatic with respect to biospecimens. One was that the proposal was to expand the definition of human subjects to include all research in which there are biospecimens being involved, whether they are identifiable or not, to require written consent for all use of shared biospecimens and stored biospecimens in secondary research, including if de-identified, to allow broad written consent for future research use, and that they promised a broad consent template from the Department of Health and Human Services, and that secondary use, if there was broad written consent at the initial encounter, could be done without any IRB review. These are the proposals, and I'm sure somebody's going to ask me what's happening with this. I wish I had a crystal ball. I think the people that I live with say it's not if, it's when, and what the content is, I do not know. So all of these public opinion, changes in policy, proposed regulations have sort of escalated this discussion about whether or not broad consent for future use of specimens and data is the way to go. So a few years ago, after the ANPRM came out, we had a workshop at the NIH which brought together a bunch of people who have worked on issues related to this topic, and Ben was a member of that group. And we talked about a number of things. We started with this. What are the ethical reasons to obtain consent when collecting biospecimens from persons for for future research use? And we came up with these 4. First of all, obtaining consent shows respect for donors and allows them to control whether their samples or data are used for research. It allows donors also to decide whether the risks of research use of their samples or data and the burdens are acceptable to them, and allows them to decide whether contributing to the goals of research is consistent with their interests, their non-welfare interests. It also promotes public trust and the ongoing viability of research by allowing donors to decide. So those were the reasons in favor, and I'm going to say a little bit more about each of them. So you all know informed consent generally promotes respect for persons, allowing them, to the degree that they're able, the opportunity to choose what will happen to them. And most persons care about being treated with respect. That seems obvious, but I think it's worth stating. And when asked, whether it's in studies or in general, you go to cocktail parties, when asked, most people want to control whether their samples or data are used for research. There have been empirical studies from around the world, over 100,000 patients, research participants, family members, religious groups, the general public, and overwhelmingly, the majority want to decide whether their samples or data will be used for research. However, when they're asked, most of them are willing to donate data or samples. People also want to be protected from risks, generally. And the risks in secondary research use of biospecimens and data are considered to be very low, and also with standard safeguards in place, risks to privacy and confidentiality are further mitigated. But it is still makes sense to give people the option of saying, do they want to even have these low risks, assume these low risks. And it also gives them the ability to choose whether or not to contribute to research and whether that's compatible with their interests. And I'm going to say more about that as we go along. Societal interests, I think I already spoke to. I think there's a sense of you're using specimens that come from people without asking them, and that, I think, makes people a little nervous. There are, however, arguments against obtaining consent when collecting biospecimens or data for future research. And they include, first of all, the fact that this kind of research is low risk, or some people would say no risk. that's further mitigated in other ways by de-identifying specimens by data security systems, et cetera. Others argue that consent and consent bias can jeopardize the science, and that instead we should promote the public expectation that everybody should contribute in a sense of solidarity and contribution to the public good or the common good. Others point out the logistics and costs of obtaining and tracking consent are enormous. Some people say it's naive in a busy clinical environment to think that any kind of consent for future use of biospecimens is meaningful or possible. And the public, again, generally supports research with stored samples because of its value to society or potential value. So what are the risks? So when you think about the risks of biospecimens and data, certainly the collection of them is not a risky thing. Sometimes there's a blood draw or a buccal swab or something like that, but those kinds of risks are really not relevant here. The risks that most people talk about are informational risks. And those include, things like embarrassment if you find out something about yourself, or anxiety, the possibility of people using information against you for things like discrimination or stigma. Many people worry about the process of re-identification if you've given your sample and it's used for some research that you don't know about and it's been de-identified, but then you can re-identify it, then you'll be associated with it. And there's also a big debate about incidental findings. Can you find things about people that in some cases you would want them to know about? And is that a good thing or is that a bad thing, and for the persons from whom the samples came? I think what's interesting about all of these risks, there's a lot of discussion of them. To my knowledge, and I'd love to be corrected on this, to my knowledge there's not a lot of data that shows that any of these risks have really come to be a big problem for people. There's a lot of fear, for example, about discrimination, but very little evidence that discrimination based on data that has generated from biospecimen research or data research has caused or led to discrimination. What about consent bias? So consent bias is the idea that if you require consent, the people who will give consent are going to be different than the people who won't give consent, and that could jeopardize the generalizability or validity of the science that you're conducting. There's, again, a lot of discussion of this issue of consent bias. I found this interesting set of papers in AJOB in 2013, where Mark Rothstein and Abigail Chauvin wrote a paper basically saying that consent bias is not such a big deal, that there's not really that much of it, and it's not that much of a threat to validity, and it's not a reason to override people's right to give consent. It was accompanied, of course, as AJOB is, by a number of commentaries, some of whom disagree with Rothstein and Chauvin, and some of whom build on what they said. I think it's a really interesting set of papers if you're interested in this, but I think, again, an unsettled question of whether consent bias is even an issue. And lots of people are worried about the costs and the logistics. This is just one comment from public comments on the Common Rule, NPRM, but it reflects a very large percentage of the comments that were given that they're worried about compliance costs. So what are the implications so far of what I've said? I think ethical concerns or ethical reasons and public opinion generally support the idea of obtaining consent or some kind of consent or permission for future research of biospecimens and data. The debate persists really because whether or not this consent is necessary or worth the burden, because the force of the reasons that support consent decline in light of, as I've mentioned, low risks, potential value, and the challenge of meaningful consent in some settings. But further, there's no consensus, even if people were to agree that consent was the right way to go, there's no consensus on what the acceptable method of obtaining consent is in any setting. So I want to spend the rest of the time talking about the possible consent methods, the costs and burdens compared to any value, the public preferences about consent methods, the data on public preferences, and some implementation challenges. So this was a chart that came out of that a paper that we published from the workshop that I mentioned that Ben was a part of, which basically took some of the main types of approaches to consent in this space, ranging from no consent at all to study-specific consent, and tried to think about what happens to the person who is the donor, perhaps, in terms of level of control. And you can see that, from no consent to study-specific consent, just intuitively, the person has a lot more control in the study-specific space. So that's one important piece. Another important piece about this, and in the way we've talked about it, is that we distinguished, which some people do and some people don't, blanket consent and broad consent, and I'll come back to that as well. In the commentaries to that paper, there were lots of really interesting other methods proposed. So some people said broad consent is not necessary. Notification of, just giving people information in some way is sufficient. Some argued for what they called cascading consent, which was basically you start by asking people for blanket consent, and if they say no, then you give them more details, and if they say no, then you give them more details, all the way up to the possibility of study-specific consent. Some argued for what they call meta-consent, which is basically letting individuals decide what kind of consent they want to give. Jessica Bardell and Nana Garrison voted for not thinking of specimens as donations, but as loans in trust, and a very different kind of view about the kind of both permission, but also the kind of care that you give to those loans over time. And many argued for the importance or the absolute essentialness, if you will, of robust engagement of communities, the communities that are going to be affected by these repositories and biobanks, in terms of allowing them to provide input on the type of consent, the content of consent, and the governance of the use of specimens. I think it's helpful to think through the difference between content and process in terms of consent, because I think these terms sometimes get mixed up. I think when we're thinking about content, and the idea of broad consent is that, there's a range from very specific, these are the details of this particular study, this particular use, to much broader. We're going to use this specimen for lots of different kinds of research. Maybe here's a kind of range of the types of research, but it's a much broader kind of description of the use. And these are different than some of the very important process decisions that also need to be made about how consent is obtained, if it is obtained in this setting. And the difference is, for example, many people think about broad consent as one-time general permission to use my specimens for any future research. But it doesn't necessarily have to be that. It can be one time, it can be recurrent, it could be even dynamic, and I'm going to talk about what dynamic means in a minute. I think similarly with opt-in and opt-out. People talk about the difference between opt-in research, consent, and opt-out consent. Important concepts. Basically you either say, yes, I want to be part, or no, I don't want to be part. That's the difference. But opt-in or opt-out consent could be broad, or it could be specific. Community involvement and community-directed decisions about consent can also encompass either a broad content or a specific content in terms of the consent process. So these are good distinctions to keep in mind. What about dynamic consent? It's gotten a lot of attention. And with the technologies that exist today, the idea is on an interactive technology-based platform, you don't have to have a one-time consent. You don't have to get somebody's consent and then say, okay, I'm done. I can use their specimens for anything in the future. But you have constant interaction or dynamic interaction with persons through technological platforms. And this group, who's done the most work on this concept of dynamic consent, says participants could consent to a broad range of uses of their samples and data, or opt to be approached on a case-by-case basis. So it could be broad or narrow, or set different preferences for different types of research in the dynamic engagement that they have with the investigators or the biobank. What about the costs and burdens of consent? So just thinking in general, we think about what are the burdens of obtaining consent? Well, so certainly there are actually burdens on donors, both time, stress, confusion, meaning, and many people say, I don't want you to come back to me 100 times. I want to know what you're going to do, and I want to make the decision now. Burden on investigators, on reviewers, on institutions and organizations, keeping track of different things, on science, the greater the limits on consent provided, some argue the reduced value of the science, and on other opportunities. So if you take that same chart I showed you before, as the control increases, so presumably does the burden. The more detail, the more control that you give to people, the more time it takes, the more tracking it takes, the more burden there is, and the more cost there likely is to this process of consent. So one way to think about how you come up with broad consent is it's in the middle. It's between the most and the least control and burden, and therefore you just pick the middle. But I think that there are other reasons that broad consent makes sense. And the way we conceived of broad consent was that it is not the same as blanket because there is specific attention to the possibility, anyway, of specified limitations. So the proposal that we came up with was broad consent for collection of biospecimens for future research use is ethically permissible and in many cases optimal when it includes initial broad consent for an unspecified range of future research, but conditional on a few content or process restrictions, accompanied by a process of oversight or governance, accompanied by an ongoing process for providing information or communicating with donors whenever feasible. And this idea supports the reasons that you would want to get consent. It allows individuals to decide whether to donate, whether the risks and are okay, and whether the research is compatible with their interests. It reduces burden on them, on the donors, of having to consider and make decisions for each new study, and burden on the investigators. The oversight process allows another way to serve donor interests by ensuring that acceptable research uses are approved. And ongoing communication allows the donors easy access to information about the research that's being done, the option of withdrawing if they want to, or changing their mind on specific issues. We also envisioned that there probably need to be exceptions to this idea of broad consent. And two that we came up with were in a national emergency where you might have to notify the public but not get their consent to obtain specimens, or in some maybe a very rare disease research where people perhaps quite legitimately want to limit the use of their samples to research on their disease and not share it with other researchers. So the initial consent, this is where we actually need some more work. The initial consent should include things like, we're collecting it and storing it. We're going to share it with others, and then the conditions under which that will happen, that there'll be general health information attached to it, that there are data security measures in place, specified limitations if there are any, oversight, ongoing communication, and processes for withdrawal. What we had a lot of debate about, and I think in the literature I still think is the sticking point on what do you tell? What is the content of the broad initial consent with respect to the range of research that might be done? And the reason this is an issue is because some people worry that there are kinds of research that members of the public would object to. And therefore the question is, how do you tell them about that possibility? Do you just tell them there might be some projects that you'll object to? Or do you give them a whole long list of possible uses of this kind of biospecimen for research and let them see, this is okay or this is not okay? The oversight process that we envisioned was the investigator proposes a study and a specific request for data or samples. There's some designee that looks at it and approves it, or if that designee says there's something different here in terms of the scientific value of this particular proposal, or the risks, or the consistency with previously specified limitations, or possible conflict with known values, then there's a larger body that looks at it. And then I mentioned the ongoing communication. It really is technologically something that we could do in this day without too much trouble, but it is, again, another oomph, adding processes for ongoing communication with donors. So what are some of the objections? So there's been actually very interesting response to the proposals put forth in the Notice of Proposed Rulemaking. Overall, there were 2,100 public comments received, and overwhelmingly, they were about biospecimen research. I think 3/4 of them were about biospecimen research. And so it's really interesting to think about that, the response. Here's one from the Secretary's Advisory Committee who thinks that broad consent is a mistake. And basically they said, public education, notice to patients, the opportunity to opt out, limitations on unauthorized re-identification are preferable in this regard to a broad consent mandate that would not represent meaningful consent and could substantially hamper scientific progress. So they're worried both about the meaningfulness of the process and the impact on science. Many people, this was from one academic medical center, were worried about the logistical burdens. This is one that says, will initiate new delays, new burdens, new impediments to biomedical discoveries. This is a seismic shift. It will be considerable, the burden will be considerable, particularly the burdens of operationalizing the consent process and building a reliable tracking infrastructure. So this was a common theme in the comments. And then there were some that were on the other side. So these are comments on sort of the other side of the argument. I suspect there's a wish that the public remain ignorant about this for fear that we will demand protections that would inconvenience researchers and would rather not be bothered, and that makes me even angrier. Or somebody who said, I strongly agree with these proposed changes and feel that the old laws were put in place before modern technologies made reverse identifying of anonymous specimens possible. I also believe many, if not most, subjects will be willing to allow their cells to be used, and that it would be fairly straightforward to administer consent, therefore it should not hinder research. So we have views on both sides. We also have views, those were public comments in the response to NPRM. There were also comments also reflecting different views in the published literature. Again, burden was a huge issue. And the second comment is really about, are we really favoring autonomy, or should we be promoting this idea of shared responsibility or solidarity in terms of specimen research? What does some of the empirical data say? And it's really quite interesting. 10 years ago, Dave Windler in my group wrote a paper where he summarized some of the data that had been collected to that point in time, 33,000 people, and he concluded that most people want to give consent, but they support one-time general consent. We've had Nana Garrison did a very helpful systematic review recently published with 48 studies, 35,000, almost 36,000 participants, and found the majority expressed support for broad consent when there were no other options offered. But when there were other options offered, many fewer expressed support for broad consent, although still in many of the studies, or most of the studies, close to half. And the willingness to give broad consent increased if data samples are de-identified, and it also varied a little bit with sociodemographics, which is not surprising. There have been some very recent publications, one from Canada that also found a lack of a clear consensus on the type of informed consent, but that respondents wanted active participatory roles in the governance and exclusion clauses. And exclusion clauses, in their view, are limitations. You can do everything, you can do any kind of future research except in a clause to have one or two limitations. There was a group, Goodman et al., who looked at participants in a cancer genetic registry, and most of the individuals in their study wanted to be either notified or asked every time a new study was done. And this was more important to ask them when the research was unrelated to the disease that they had. There was an online survey that Tom Tomlinson and Ray DeVries did. There have been a couple publications on this, but one of the things that they did, which I thought was really interesting, is they put a whole list of potentially objectionable kinds of research into the survey to see if that made a difference in terms of people's responses. And it didn't that much, actually, in terms of the kinds of things that they were willing to do. I mean, the kinds of consent, excuse me, that they were willing to, that they thought was best. But what they concluded was that they said broad consent and specific consent were the worst options based on their survey. And I just want to show you one thing about how this was set up. These were the options: blanket by itself, a whole set of blanket with a caution, with a withdrawal, with limits, and then real-time specific. And so the worst were this, unacceptable, where's unacceptable? Worst option were this, specific, and this, blanket. And everything else, which I would call broad, looked more acceptable. There is the Emerge network is doing maybe has done, I'm not sure where it stands at the moment, but 80,000 individuals who will be surveyed about this issue. So we'll get great data, I'm sure, from this study. Importantly, if you look at all of these studies, there's a substantial minority, and sometimes actually a little bit more than a minority, who would not provide consent for future unspecified use of their biospecimens. So how to put that into perspective? If 40% of the people say they would and 40% of the people say they wouldn't, what does that mean about this method of obtaining consent? There are definitely groups that are underrepresented, and there's only beginning to be attention to this issue in the low and middle income countries. So one question to ask is, what do these data mean? Some people say public understanding of research is limited, and therefore you have to take these data with a grain of salt. And certainly there are lots of things that affect people's attitudes about research. One author, Master, even wrote, public preference data is unreliable and inconsistent, and therefore we should ignore it. But I think there's a little bit of a sense where attending to the public views shows some respect for their views and helps to assure acceptability of the research. So in conclusion, there are various descriptions and models of broad consent. The defining feature is consent to a broad, but not necessarily unlimited, range of future research with biospecimens or data. Broad consent for such future research is preferable, in my view and in many others' views, to no consent, and preferable to other forms of consent in most circumstances. Broad consent comprised of a broad initial consent, oversight of the use of the specimens and data, and an opportunity for continued interaction is optimal. There are still some remaining challenges. I think we still need to reconcile this view, which you saw in the public comments to the NPRM, of respect for public views and the desire to decide about their use of specimens and data, with concerns about costs, logistical complexity, and potential impact on science. We don't have a resolution there. We also need to agree on criteria for determining when consent is called for and the advantages and disadvantages of consent methods in different settings. I think it's not crazy to think about, how setting matters in this regard and what is possible in different settings and how meaningful a process would be. We also need education and engagement of the public in these discussions, more than we've already had. And some decisions about how the role of public preference data is relevant to how we set policies. And also ensuring the quality of the studies that we rely on to reflect public preferences. I think we also need to be very clear about what we mean by broad consent, because it means a lot of things to different people, and what it entails, and is it feasible in different settings. I think I've already said that. We need to continue to have dialogue and data on what the initial broad consent description should be. And it might be different in different places, and I think there's even a possibility of influencing maybe the DHHS template in that regard. What are the appropriate limitations? What do participants want to know? What do they object to? And how does that vary from context to context? We need to develop streamlined, efficient, but effective oversight mechanisms and strive for ongoing engagement and consider more effective ways or more universal ways, if you will, of engaging communities in these processes. And I'm happy to take questions. Thank you.
Yeah, if people have questions, they should come to the microphone. And maybe I'll ask a question while people are coming up. Christine, my first question was, as you pointed out, there can be a range of different interpretations of broad consent. And the SACCARP suggestion for notification with opt-out could be thought about as a broad consent, even though they said it wasn't. I'm just curious to your thoughts about that.
I think I agree with you, Ben. I think it's if you separate, as I suggested, content and process, it depends on what the notification entails. And if the notification says, we are going to do a range of research with we're going to collect your specimens, we're going to keep them, we're going to share them, we're going to do a range of research with them, which might include this and might not include this. I mean, the limitations piece is a little complicated. And people see that or given that information, and then they have the option of opting out. That could, in my view, actually count as broad consent. Yes, absolutely. But it's a different process. Yeah.
Thank you very much. That was very interesting and thought-provoking. I had a couple of questions. One is, there's no mention of potential financial or industrial use of the specimens, and so and again, we're encouraging development and translation. Should be that part of this, and is it part of it? And how do people think if they say, oh, the hospital may or the institution may financially gain from my specimens?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it probably should be on the list of things. I mean, I think two things about that I think are really important. One is that a lot of research that uses biospecimens does end up with commercial development of something or other, and somebody makes money off that often.
Right. Hopefully us.
Hopefully, yeah, hopefully. So that is very important in terms of what the research might include, I guess is the way I would say it. The other thing, and I've neglected to put this on the slide, but if you read some of the public preference data, when you ask people what they do care about, what they might object to, one of the things is commercial use.
Right.
And so I think you're absolutely right, and I should put it on the list. Talking to people at the initial broad consent about the potential for commercial use and who gets the benefits of that is probably very important.
Yeah,
and some people, some people argue that's going to lead to some people not participating, but that's
I think there have been some abuses with that, so I personally think it should be included.
No,
I have
good
another
point.
question about, as there's a lot of pressure or competition for specialists and people, small hospitals that are not necessarily academic, may not even have either a robust or any research program, but want to attract people.
Right.
Should there be some, is there some requirement for, if you're asking for research access to specimens that you have an IRB, that you know what I'm saying? I can see the use of a broad consent as a way of getting samples and then either for commercial or for trying to recruit in or begin a research program. I was just curious about that.
Yeah. So you may know or may have noticed that one of the proposed changes to the common rule is that well, let me stop and say, not all research falls under the common rule no matter what, right? You know that. But one of the proposed changes is that if you were to obtain broad consent for future use of biospecimens, you would need IRB review in the future. I disagree with that proposal, actually. I think that some oversight of the use of specimens and data is a very important check on quality. And so, I don't know if that answers your question, but that's my view.
So I had a couple of questions. The first was about, if a lot of the debate is about what counts as meaningful consent or whether you can really get people to understand what you need them to, I was wondering what your view is. I know you've done a lot of research on short forms versus long forms. What is the best evidence available about what kinds of approaches to consent might actually get us to a place where people can give meaningful consent in a very quick fashion, and
Yeah.
also what more research is needed there. And the second set of issues I was interested in was about non-welfare interests.
Yeah.
How do we know what people care about? You know, is it things that are just controversial, like cloning? Is it things that people have certain religious views really suggest are problematic?
Right.
So how do we figure that out? And do you know if there's any research on
Yeah.
that?
Great questions. Not surprising. So meaningful. What's meaningful? That is a huge question, and I think you all know that we have in all spheres of clinical research, we have plenty of data to suggest that understanding of people about the details of studies is at best variable. I think what we don't have consensus about is what do they really need to know to be able to give meaningful consent. And I think that applies in this setting as well. So there is a way in which you could think that somebody who really understood that you're taking my blood now or taking my tumor tissue now, you're going to put it in a repository somewhere, you're going to share it with other researchers, you're going to do a broad range of research, somebody's going to look at it and make sure that there's nothing that's sort of objectionable about it, that could be meaningful, that's a meaningful, yes, okay, that's fine with me. But some people argue, and you may be aware of this, that it's impossible to give meaningful consent if you don't know every use. And I think I disagree with that. I think that you can give meaningful consent to a broad use. And especially if you're confident that there's somebody else sort of paying attention to how it's used. So that's my view on that. With respect to non-welfare interests, I think it's a really important question and one that we don't have a good handle on in any way. And so the workshop that I mentioned, that was the thing we disagreed about the most. What are the kinds of research that people object to? And the little bit of data that exists on this, suggests things like, okay, reproductive cloning. Well, duh, right? Everybody objects to that. Some of it is commercial use. Some people object to that. But there isn't a lot of other good data on what people object to. The study that I mentioned, the Tom Tomlinson study, they had a list of kinds of research that they asked for people's opinions about. And I respect their work, and I think it's wonderful work, but I found the list a little slanted, if you want to think about it that way. So the ones that I remember are, research on improving methods of abortion, research on growing kidney stem cells in pigs and then inserting them into humans, research on developing vaccines for bioterror agents. So things that, okay, maybe people do object to, but those are sort of, in my view, not the normal kind of research that's done with large, so I don't think we have a good handle on it. I think the other thing that makes sense to me, although it's burden, different communities and different groups of people probably have different views about what they object to. And so one possible way to approach it is, with all the caveats on how hard this is to do, engaging communities in very rigorous ways so that you can get a handle on, for this community of people who are donating specimens to this biobank, what do they care about, and what might we be very careful about doing with their specimens?
My question was exactly that, about, and in thinking of it in terms of language, in terms of different racial and ethnic and international communities. Do you need to get consent in their language? How do you assure that they understand what they're consenting to?
I think, I would say in general that if you believe, as I do, that the purpose of consent is to give people information that they can make a decision about, it's got to be in a language they understand. And that means not only, English versus Spanish, but, 12th grade versus 6th grade or whatever. It just really needs to be appropriate to the persons that you're approaching.
The last question.
Hey, Elliot.
Good morning. Thank you for that talk. I don't know what research is going to be like in 5 years or 20 years, and I think part of this kind of assumes an ability to predict the future.
Yep.
And how important do you think it is that things that these specimens will be used for are likely things we can't even imagine right now?
Yeah. That's a great question, and I think, I probably should have said it more clearly. I think that's the reason that we're talking about this at all. I think that, we're using specimens today that were collected 30 years ago for things that we never would have thought about. Maybe some of you followed the recent sort of definitive debunking of patient zero as spreading HIV, because there were samples that people could go back and look at and using phylogenetics figure out that, in fact, HIV existed in the United States a long time before this poor young guy got implicated. And there are other good examples of that. So at the time we're collecting specimens or data, we can't really anticipate all the possible things that we might use them for, which is the reason why this notion of broad permission to use things for future research makes sense to me. That if people can be okay with that, with some limitations and some confidence in the oversight, then what they're agreeing to is the reality that 20 years from now we might be doing things that we can't even talk about today because we don't know what they are. And I think with data that's even the same thing.
So we're at the end. I want to say one really quick comment, Christine. I actually agree with almost everything that you've said, with one exception,
Okay.
which is the label of broad consent.
Okay.
And my point there is that by broad, it describes broadness, but this is actually very specific as a context. Collection of material for research as compared to all the things we can do with our life. And so this is a very narrow topic. Anyway, I want to thank Christine. We have a very exciting day with her and Heather, and we'll see you next year.